All right. Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at, well, a pretty wild time.
Yeah.
The U.S. during Trump's second term, specifically 2025 to 2029.
Wow.
And, I mean, this is, it's kind of like walking into the future blindfolded, you know?
Yeah.
Like, imagine you're handed this pile of, like, translated articles and transcripts. You have no idea what's going on.
Right. It's a fascinating period, for sure.
Yeah.
Lots of twists and turns, unexpected things happening. We're talking about a time of, like, intense political polarization, a global landscape that's constantly shifting.
Yeah.
And, you know, serious challenges for the U.S., both domestically and internationally. I mean, think economic turmoil.
Okay.
A resurgent Iran.
Oh, wow.
And some really, really surprising political alliances.
So, okay, let's try to unpack this a little. First off, Trump back in the White House.
Right.
I mean, that in itself was a twist that I don't think many people saw coming. Given all the controversy, the legal battles during his first term, I mean, what happened?
His victory definitely came as a shock to many.
Yeah.
And it seems like there was this perfect storm of, you know, economic anxieties, a deep sense of disillusionment with the establishment.
Right.
And people just yearning for that political outsider. And it kind of converged and paved the way for him to get back in.
Okay, and he kept going on about this whole deep state narrative. Can you explain that for our listeners who, you know, they're new to this future? What does that even mean?
So the way Trump and his supporters see it, the deep state, is it's a shadowy, unelected network of bureaucrats and elites. And they believe that these people are actively working to undermine his agenda.
Okay.
And this idea really resonated with a lot of people who just felt ignored by the political establishment.
So, okay, so even with all the divisive rhetoric and the, you know, kind of the track record, they were willing to overlook that because they felt like he was fighting for them.
Yeah, against this hidden enemy.
Right.
He tapped into this wellspring of frustration, presented himself as the champion of the forgotten.
Yeah.
The one who would drain the swamp and take on the establishment.
Classic.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of questionable decisions, let's talk about his cabinet. Matt Gaetz as Secretary of Defense. A congressman with, you know, accusations of serious misconduct. That's raising a lot of eyebrows even in our time.
Oh, absolutely. It was a controversial appointment, to say the least.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this pattern we see in Trump's second term.
Wow.
He had a preference for loyalty over experience.
Loyalty.
Yeah.
Okay.
He surrounded himself with people who would not challenge him.
Right.
Regardless of their qualifications or, you know, past conduct.
Okay, I'm trying to, like, understand how this works. Gaetz has zero military experience.
Yeah.
How does this even get past Congress?
Well, the Republicans held the majority
Right.
in both houses, and despite some misgivings within their ranks, they largely rubber-stamped all of Trump's nominees.
Okay, so the alarm bells are already ringing. Were there any other appointments that made people kind of scratch their heads?
Oh, yeah, a few. For example, Pam Bondi as Attorney General,
Right.
someone known for her very conservative leanings.
Okay.
And then he also picked several ambassadors known for their strong pro-Israel stance, which brings us to another major point.
Yeah, the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Exactly. Trump's approach to this was very different from his predecessor, Biden.
Yeah.
Biden, I guess you could say, is more of an ideological Zionist.
Right.
Believes in the right of a Jewish state in that historic land. His approach was maybe a bit more balanced, but Trump was much more transactional.
Okay, can you explain what you mean by transaction? I mean, for our listener just dropping into this future, what would that look like?
Essentially, he was willing to support Israel,
Okay.
but he was focused on what benefited the U.S.
Right.
So, for example, in his first term, he actually pressured Netanyahu into accepting a ceasefire with Hamas.
Oh, wow.
Because he didn't want to get dragged into a long conflict.
He didn't want to deal with it.
Exactly.
I remember there was also that time he publicly criticized Netanyahu for obstructing the peace deals, which was like a major departure from the typical unwavering support that Israel gets.
Yeah, and that points to this sort of volatile relationship between the two leaders.
Yeah.
There were personality clashes, policy disagreements, and a lot of political maneuvering going on.
Right.
But ultimately, Trump was all about maintaining a relationship that served his interests.
Not necessarily about peace at all costs.
Exactly.
So what did all this mean for the Palestinians? I mean, especially given the prediction that Israel could assert full control over the West Bank by 2025.
Yeah, the picture for them is pretty grim.
Yeah.
With Trump's administration packed with pro-Israel figures,
Right.
it's unlikely they would have opposed such a move. So the Palestinians were facing this incredibly difficult future, and their hope for their own state was fading fast.
It's starting to sound pretty bleak. And I mean, didn't Trump talk about ending wars?
He did.
And he even said he wanted to win a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, right.
Did any of that happen?
His actions often contradicted his words.
Yeah.
His whole America First policy really prioritized disentangling the U.S. from foreign conflicts,
Right.
even if it meant leaving allies kind of hanging.
So, for example, the war in Ukraine. Would Trump have pushed for a peace deal there?
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah.
He probably would have pushed for a negotiated settlement,
Right.
maybe involving major concessions from Ukraine just to end U.S. involvement quickly.
So essentially leaving Europe to fend for itself.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
He believed Europe should take care of its own security and shouldn't rely so much on the U.S.
Okay.
But, that would have left them vulnerable, potentially emboldened Russia, created a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, so how would all of this affect the Middle East, specifically the Gulf countries?
So that's where things get really interesting. He's pushing for peace in some areas, but his energy policies are shaking things up in others. I mean, think withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, boosting domestic oil and gas production.
And wasn't he also pressuring Saudi Arabia and OPEC to increase production?
Yes.
Which would drive down global prices?
Exactly. And it's a move with significant consequences.
Right.
On the one hand, it weakens Russia, helps control inflation in the U.S.
Right.
But on the other hand, it puts a lot of pressure on the economies of those oil-producing countries.
Yeah.
Many of them U.S. allies.
So these countries are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, right? They need the oil revenue.
Yeah.
But they also don't want to antagonize the U.S.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Right.
And it highlights how unpredictable Trump's foreign policy could be.
Okay, so we can't forget about Trump's, focus on social issues in his second term. He issued a number of executive orders.
Yeah, targeting the LGBT community, particularly healthcare, education, military service.
And this was a move that really played directly into the culture wars, right?
Yeah.
I mean, dividing the nation.
Yeah, it energized his base, but it also drew a lot of criticism from human rights groups.
Right, who said it was discriminatory.
Yeah.
Okay, so he really doubled down on the issues that brought him to power in the first place.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've got a lot to unpack here. We talked about Trump's return, his controversial cabinet picks, the global impact, and this looming threat from Iran. But before we dig deeper into those issues, let's take a closer look at life in America itself. We'll explore that after this.
So we've laid out kind of the broad strokes of Trump's second term and the global situation. But what was it actually like to live in America during this time?
Yeah.
How did all of these events trickle down and impact daily lives?
Right, because it's one thing to talk about foreign policy and cabinet appointments and all that.
Right.
What was the mood like on the ground?
Yeah.
What were people talking about, worrying about, hoping for?
Well, imagine a society where every conversation, every news cycle, every social media feed is dominated by politics. That's what it was like.
Sure.
The country was just so deeply divided.
Right.
It felt like everything was viewed through this political lens.
We're seeing some echoes of that even now, right? This idea that your political beliefs dictate your whole life.
Exactly.
Like where you shop and who you're friends with. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it created this atmosphere of suspicion and hostility.
Right.
Families were torn apart, friendships were strained.
Right.
People were hesitant to even express their opinions openly, for fear of backlash or even violence.
It was a scary time.
It was a very tense and uncertain time to be an American.
And what about the economy? I mean, we talked about the potential fallout from Trump's energy policies.
Right.
How did things actually play out for the average person?
It was a mixed bag, really. Okay, I mean, his focus on deregulation and tax cuts did lead to some initial economic growth.
Okay.
The stock market was soaring, unemployment rates went down, but those benefits were mostly concentrated at the top.
Right, so the trickle-down effect that was promised didn't really happen for most people.
Not quite.
Okay.
A lot of working-class Americans found themselves struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living.
Yeah.
Healthcare costs were still skyrocketing.
Right.
And despite that initial boost, the national debt ballooned under his tax cuts.
So it was kind of a temporary.
Yeah, and there was this growing sense that the system was rigged against them.
Right.
That the American dream was slipping away.
Which, ironically, just solidified Trump's position, right?
Right.
He was still seen as, like, the champion of the forgotten man.
Yeah.
Even as his policies mainly benefited the wealthy.
It's classic populism, and it worked.
Yeah.
He was incredibly skilled at tapping into people's frustrations.
Right.
Anxieties, and then channeling them towards a common enemy.
Okay.
Immigrants, liberals, the deep state, anyone who didn't fit into his vision of America.
And this was all happening as social media was on the rise.
Right.
Which, as we know, can be really powerful for spreading misinformation and amplifying, like, extreme voices.
It played a huge role in shaping the political landscape back then.
Yeah.
It created these echo chambers where people were only exposed to information that confirmed their biases.
It's like you only see what you want to see.
Exactly. And it made it almost impossible to have a nuanced conversation, across political divides.
So, this increasingly divided nation, grappling with economic anxiety, and then just bombarded with misinformation.
Yeah.
What was the overall impact of all this on American society?
Well, you saw this rise in social unrest
Right.
and political extremism.
Okay.
Protests, counter-protests, and unfortunately even violence. Trust in institutions just plummeted.
So people were just disillusioned.
Yeah, they were angry, searching for someone to blame.
And Trump was, willing to provide those scapegoats. It's like part of his strategy.
It was a core part of his political strategy.
And the consequences are probably still being felt today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The social fabric of the nation was really stretched thin.
Right.
And the wounds of that era are far from healed.
It's like America went through this collective trauma.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
There was this sense of loss. A loss of innocence.
Yeah.
A loss of faith in the idea that America could be a united nation.
So we've painted kind of a bleak picture here.
Yeah.
Were there any glimmers of hope?
Of course, there are always individuals and groups fighting for justice, equality, a better future.
Right.
There were acts of kindness, resilience, and compassion that reminded us of the enduring spirit of the American people.
That's good to hear.
Even in the darkest of times, there's always that human capacity for hope.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
It's crucial to study history.
Right.
Understand how we got to where we are.
Yeah.
And learn from the mistakes of the past.
So we don't repeat them.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We have the political climate, the economic landscape, the social divisions.
Right.
The global impact of Trump's second term.
Yeah.
But there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Iran.
Right. They've been lurking in the background of this whole conversation.
They have.
We know they were a major target of his administration.
Right.
But we haven't really dug into the specifics of how that all played out.
And I have a feeling it's a story filled with a lot of tension.
Oh, yeah.
And intrigue. And potentially some very high stakes.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's a complex and volatile relationship, one that really had a profound impact on the global stage.
Okay, well, let's not keep our listeners waiting any longer. When we come back, we're going to dive deep into that turbulent relationship between the U.S. and Iran during this really pivotal time in history. All right, so we've been talking about, all this craziness that was Trump's second term,
right?
The drama, the economy, social divisions, global impact. And now let's turn our attention to a country that was constantly in the headlines.
Yeah.
Iran.
Iran.
So for our listener who's, new to this future, can you give us some context on what was happening there?
So picture this. Iran in 2024, they're facing all these blows that really weaken their position in the region.
Okay.
Like, it was a bad year for them.
So, what happened? What made 2024 such a turning point?
Well, Hezbollah, their main ally in Lebanon,
Right.
suffered heavy losses. We're talking about, top leaders being killed. Hassan Nasrallah, his successor, Hashim Safi al-Din, their elite Radwan force, basically crippled.
Wow. I mean, Hezbollah was like one of the most powerful groups in the region.
Exactly.
What about Hamas in Gaza?
Hamas also had a rough year with major figures, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammediev, taken out. And even more shocking, Ismail Haniyeh,
right,
the head of Hamas's political bureau, assassinated in Tehran.
Assassinated in Tehran. That's a direct attack.
On Iranian soil.
Wow. So, I mean, it must have been a huge blow to their image, right?
Huge.
Like, if they can't protect their allies in their own capital,
yeah,
how can they project power anywhere else.
It really exposed a vulnerability they didn't see coming.
Okay.
And while they did retaliate, they had these 2 missile strikes. They called them Al-Sadek-1 and Al-Sadek-2.
Right.
But it wasn't enough to really change anything.
So you've got a weakened Iran facing a more assertive Israel.
Right.
And a U.S. president who has, in the past, been willing to walk away from the nuclear deal.
Right.
What options did Iran have left?
A lot of people, analysts, even some within the Iranian leadership itself, believed that going nuclear was the only way to regain leverage.
So like the North Korea model.
Exactly. Basically, develop their nuclear capabilities as quickly as possible to become a nuclear power, even without formally declaring it.
It's a risky strategy.
Very high risk.
But they felt it was necessary.
Yeah, to survive, basically.
Wow. So this must have created a real dilemma for Trump.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he pulled out of the nuclear deal in his first term.
Right.
And now they're closer than ever to actually getting a bomb.
Yeah, it seemed like his actions backfired.
Big time.
But Trump, being Trump, he saw this as an opportunity.
An opportunity. An opportunity for what?
To be the peacemaker.
Okay.
He knew a military strike on Iran was risky, could destabilize the whole region, send oil prices sky high. Not good for him domestically.
Right, right.
But if he could somehow broker a deal, prevent Iran from going nuclear, ease tensions in the Middle East, well...
The Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
So he needed Iran to cooperate?
He did.
But he couldn't appear weak or, alienate his pro-Israel base. It's like, how do you even approach that?
He basically orchestrated this total shift in U.S. policy towards the region.
Okay.
It started with containment. Luckily for him, the events of 2024 had already weakened Iran's influence.
Right. Like we talked about, Hezbollah and Hamas were struggling.
Right. The Houthis in Yemen were forced into a ceasefire.
Okay.
Even Assad in Syria was losing ground.
So with Iran's allies kind of on the back foot, what steps did he take to capitalize on this?
First move, pushing for a settlement between Israel and Hamas.
Okay.
Remember, Trump doesn't like long conflicts.
Right.
Especially those that threaten, global energy markets.
Right, right. So this time, Netanyahu was more willing to play along.
Absolutely. He knew Trump was serious.
Right.
And he didn't want to lose U.S. support.
Okay.
Plus, with the threat from Iran looming larger,
right,
Israel wanted to secure that southern border.
Okay, peace in Gaza, at least for now.
Right.
But what about the big issue, Iran's nuclear ambitions? How did he address that?
This is where things get really interesting. Instead of threats and sanctions, he went for a more pragmatic approach, a total U-turn from before. He reached out to the Iranians, offered them a revised nuclear deal.
The revised deal? After all that talk about tearing up the original
Wait, but remember, Trump is all about the deal.
Right.
He knew the original deal wasn't perfect, but walking away backfired.
Right.
He needed a win.
Yeah.
And a new deal with Iran could be huge.
So how did the Iranians react to this? Were they open to talking?
Well, at first they were skeptical. I mean, they'd been betrayed before. And Trump's, not exactly predictable.
Right.
But they were facing a lot of pressure.
Right.
Both at home and internationally.
Domestic pressure. What do you mean by that?
People in Iran were suffering.
Right.
Sanctions, economic mismanagement.
Okay.
There were protests, calls for reform, even challenges to the regime.
Wow. So they had a real incentive to negotiate.
They did.
But what about their nuclear program? I mean, they saw it as crucial for their security.
It was the sticking point. They felt like it was essential for their survival, the only way to deter attacks.
So how do they reconcile those competing pressures? Do they manage to strike a deal?
The negotiations were long and tough, and the outcome has had, consequences that we're still dealing with today.
So it sounds like the fate of the world was hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
But that's a story for another deep dive, maybe.
Another time.
So for our listener who's just starting to explore this time in history, what's the biggest takeaway for them?
I think the main lesson is that the future is rarely what we expect.
Right.
Even with huge challenges and deep conflicts,
Yeah.
there's always room for the unexpected.
Right.
Individual choices, even those of someone like Trump,
Yeah.
can have a huge impact.
Wow.
And shape history in ways we can't even imagine.
Well said. And with that thought-provoking insight, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into Trump's America. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.